What if I told you the most famous crowns in Britain were sometimes balanced on top of shaking hands, trembling nerves, and habits that couldn't be politely applauded at court? What if the stiff upper lip was, in private, a stiff drink, a cigarette, a syringe of pain relief, or a roulette wheel spun one more desperate time? Tonight we're counting down 25 royals whose compulsions were powerful enough to bend health, money, marriages, and sometimes the machinery of the state itself. This isn't gossip dressed up as history. Where the record is solid, we'll say so. Letters, medical notes, diaries, parliamentary whispers, and the testimony of people paid to keep quiet. Where it's disputed, we'll be honest about that too. If you like long, calm stories that tell the truth without shouting, tap like, subscribe, and settle in. Lower the lights, let the past unfold slowly, one habit at a time. Rank 25, Henry I of England. We begin at the bottom of the list with a maybe, because Henry I's most famous indulgence sits right on the border between documented habit and immortal rumour. Henry I, fourth son of William the Conqueror, died in Normandy in late 1135. And medieval chroniclers loved a moral lesson almost as much as they loved a scandal. So the story hardened quickly. The king ate lampreys, rich, slippery, expensive, eel-like fish, despite being warned not to, and then he paid for it. The reason the tale stuck is simple. It sounds like medieval reality. A monarch surrounded by abundance, physicians who were respected but not obeyed, a court culture where no was dangerous and more was loyalty. The setup writes itself: a winter table, heavy sauces, wine, our laughter that's a little too loud because the boss is laughing. Then the pivot, sudden illness, fever, and a king fading. Except historians have always had to wrestle with what that actually means. Surfeit in old accounts can imply overeating, yes, but it can also be a tidy explanation for food poisoning, infection, or any number of ailments that don't fit a neat morale. Lampreys can be blamed because lampreys are memorable. The king died of lampreys is a story you can repeat in one breath. But here's the part that earns him a place on this countdown anyway. Whether or not lampreys were the literal cause, Henry's death became a case study in how personal indulgence and personal health can flip a country's future. He died without a secure male heir. After a lifetime of political calculation, and the result was the succession crisis that later generations called the anarchy. Civil war, contested legitimacy, noble opportunism, and years of instability. So even at rank 25, the pattern begins. A royal weakness, real, exaggerated, or weaponized, doesn't stay private for long. It becomes a story people use. It becomes a political tool. And speaking of habits that left a trail far beyond the palace walls, we move from a medieval legend to a modern addiction that's documented right down to the ash. Rank 24, King George VI. If Henry I is a cautionary tale told by chroniclers, George VI is the opposite, a man photographed, filmed, and medically monitored in an era where a king's body became national property. A George VI came to the throne in 1936 under the shadow of abdication and anxiety. He carried the pressure of war, public expectation, and a private struggle with confidence that he worked on relentlessly. And through all of it, there was a habit that looked ordinary at the time, almost patriotic in a strange way: smoking. In the first half of the 20th century, cigarettes were treated as comfort, nerves, camaraderie, and routine. For a working man, they were a break. For a soldier, a ration. For a king trying to seem steady, they were something you could hold when you didn't want your hands to shake. The setup is painfully familiar. Stress feeds the habit becomes the stress management plan, and the plan becomes a trap. Contemporary observers and later accounts describe George VI as a heavy smoker. He also faced serious health problems in the years after the Second World War, with a sequence of illnesses and operations that the public learned about in careful, controlled statements. The pivot arrives in the early 1950s when his health deteriorated sharply. In 1951, he underwent major surgery for lung cancer, an intervention that, even now, sounds brutal and then would have sounded like something from a grim industrial age. The public saw him thinner, more tired, and still trying to present steadiness as if it were a uniform he could button over pain. The consequence is stark and dated. February 1952. George VI dies at 56. The nation mourns a king who had been framed as dutiful endurance personified. And the uncomfortable truth is that duty doesn't cancel biology. Tobacco doesn't respect crowns. The addiction was not theatrical, not scandalous, not even particularly surprising for the period, which is exactly why it matters. Sometimes the most damaging habit is the one everyone politely pretends is normal. Compared to the royals higher up this list, George VI isn't worst because he partied. He's worst because the habit fused with pressure and shortened a reign at the moment stability mattered most. And that leads us to a figure who lived far longer, smiled far more often, and still carried a quiet, habitual chemistry set of her own. Rank, 23, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. If George VI's smoking reads like tragedy, the Queen Mother's habits often get packaged as charm. That's how palace mythology works. The same behaviour looks different depending on whether the story needs grit, glamour, or reassurance. Elizabeth Bowes Lyon, later known as the Queen Mother, became a symbol of cheerfulness under bombardment and resilience through national grief. She also belonged to a social world where cigarettes and alcohol were not merely accepted, they were furniture. The setup is almost too gentle to notice. A drink before dinner, a cigarette with friends, another drink because the day was long, another cigarette because that's what the room smells like anyway. Over decades, ritual becomes reliance, and reliance becomes identity. Staff recollections and biographical accounts have long described her affection for a regular pre-dinner drink, often remembered as a gin and Dubonnet-style routine, and for smoking, especially in an era when it was tied to sociability and poise. The pivot, in her case, is not a single collapse, but the slow shaping of a public character, the warm, slightly mischievous older royal who enjoyed life. It's flattering until you remember that enjoyed life can be a polite phrase for couldn't imagine an evening without it. The evidence here is softer than a medical file, but still substantial. Repeated, consistent descriptions over time from those around her, along with the broader context of upper-class British drinking culture in the mid-20th century. Consequences are complicated. The Queen Mother lived into her second century, which tempts people to treat the habits as harmless. But longevity doesn't prove safety. It proves luck, genetics, and medical attention that most people never had. It also proves that addiction doesn't always announce itself as ruin. Sometimes it's a lifelong relationship with a substance that never quite becomes a scandal, because it's wrapped in laughter and careful presentation. Compared with George VI, her habits didn't end a reign early. Compared with the royals higher up this list, she didn't rack up catastrophic debts or public humiliations. But she does represent something quietly important. How the royal image can normalize the very coping mechanisms that would be criticized in anyone else. And speaking of normalization, let's move to a monarch whose addiction was so common it was almost invisible, until the doctors started sounding like they were pleading. Rank 22. King George V. George V reigned from 1910 to 1936, bridging the last confident years before the First World War into a period where monarchies across Europe fell or were forced to evolve. He's often remembered as solid, conventional, dutiful, the kind of king who looks like he was born wearing responsibility, and yet his private life contained the same quiet dependency that haunted so many men of his generation. Nicotine, daily and heavy. The setup is the era itself. Cigarettes become mass-produced, widely marketed, and socially embedded. Smoking isn't merely allowed, it's encouraged. It's tied to masculinity, discipline, and relaxation, even as medical understanding begins to gather ominous clues. A king who smokes is a king who looks calm. A king who doesn't smoke might look nervous. Image matters, and the cigarette is a small prop with a big role. The pivot with George V is that his health did not stay politely separate from his habit. He suffered chronic respiratory problems in his later years, and the public watched the palace issue increasingly careful bulletins about the king's condition. In private, physicians and courtiers could see what was happening more clearly. The body weakening, the breathing harder, the margin for recovery shrinking. We also know something else about the end of his life that casts a cold light across the whole culture of quiet management around royal bodies. In January 1936, as George V lay dying, his doctor, acting within a mindset that mixed compassion, control, and class authority, administered drugs to hasten the end, shaping the timing so the death would be announced in the morning papers rather than as late-night chaos. That detail isn't George's addiction, but it is part of the same ecosystem. The palace and its medical gatekeepers managing a king's body as an instrument of state. The consequence, in the public story, is a dignified passing and an easy transition. The private story is darker and more human. An aging man with damaged lungs, a household trying to control decline, and a court culture that treated nicotine as normal until it became undeniable. Compared to the Queen Mother, George V's habit sits closer to a medical timeline. Symptoms, deterioration, inevitability. Compared to George VI, it's the same poison in a different decade. And if you think this is all too restrained, don't worry. The further we go, the less these habits stay discreet. Because next comes a royal who tried to escape responsibility entirely and carried his vices with him like luggage. Rank 21. Edward VIII, Duke of Windsor. Edward VIII is the royal version of a car crash in slow motion. Glamorous, avoidable, and endlessly examined. He reigned for less than a year in 1936 before abdicating, and the romance narrative usually steals the spotlight. But when you step back, what you see is also a lifestyle built around appetite, social, chemical, and emotional. The setup is Edward as the Prince of Wales, the golden boy of the interwar years, fashionable, restless, surrounded by wealth and attention. His world ran on parties, travel, late nights, and the constant hum of being observed. In that kind of life, cigarettes and cocktails aren't just accessories, they become punctuation marks. A cigarette to signal boredom, another to signal charm, a drink to soften the edge of scrutiny, another drink because everyone else is drinking, and it would be awkward not to. The pivot is how quickly routine becomes reliance when the pressure rises. Abdication didn't remove scrutiny, it intensified it. Exile doesn't cure a habit, it often deepens it. As Duke of Windsor, Edward lived in a social orbit where indulgence was both comfort and identity, and where the line between hedonism and dependency blurs because the money keeps flowing and the consequences can be outsourced. Evidence here is less about a single medical file and more about consistent portraiture. Observers, biographers, and contemporaries repeatedly described the Duke's heavy smoking and the steady presence of alcohol in his circle. It's not the most shocking vice on this list, but it is a crucial bridge between royal habits and royal avoidance. The habit becomes part of the refusal to slow down, to reflect, to endure discomfort without chemical help. The consequence is not just personal health, though the body always pays eventually, but a broader erosion of seriousness. The monarchy survived his abdication, but it did so partly by drawing a thick line between duty and indulgence. The dutiful brother stays, the glamorous brother goes. That narrative is tidy, but the truth is messier. Edward wasn't simply romantic. He was habituated to a life where impulse rarely met a hard boundary. Compared with George V and George VI, Edward's smoking is less about wartime stress and more about a cultivated identity. Compared with the Queen Mother, the drinking is not cozy, it's escapist. And speaking of escapism disguised as medicine, we now step into the 19th century, where grief could be bottled, prescribed, and swallowed in the dark. Rank 20, Queen Victoria. When people imagine Queen Victoria, they picture black mourning dress and relentless duty. They don't usually picture the medicine bottle. But Victorian medicine, especially among the wealthy, relied heavily on sedatives and opiate-based preparations that were legal, common, and frequently treated as harmless until dependence took root. The setup begins with pain and insomnia, two forces that can grind anyone down, royal or not. Victoria's life contained immense physical strain, pregnancies, chronic discomfort, and then the emotional catastrophe of Prince Albert's death in 1861. Grief didn't come with compassionate therapy sessions. It came with doctors, tonics, and the era's faith in calming the nervous system. And in that world, laudanum, opium in alcohol, was a go-to remedy. So were other sleeping draughts as pharmaceutical chemistry advanced. For a grieving monarch expected to function, sleep wasn't a luxury, it was a state requirement. If a medicine offered rest, it wasn't framed as weakness, it was framed as necessary maintenance. The pivot is that necessity can quietly become reliant. Contemporary medical practice often encouraged regular dosing, and elite patients had easy access, privacy, and physicians who were more likely to manage symptoms than challenge the underlying dependency. In Victoria's case, biographical accounts and medical correspondence have long suggested periods of significant reliance on sedatives to manage sleeplessness and distress. That isn't a dramatic scandal. It's a slow, private pattern that feels almost modern in its logic. Keep going, whatever it takes. The consequence is subtle but important. Victoria's mourning became political theatre. Her withdrawal from public life created constitutional friction. Her return to ceremonial visibility was watched like weather. A monarch's emotional condition mattered to the nation, and medication became part of the mechanism that kept the machine running. Compared with Edward VIII's cocktail and cigarette escape, Victoria's chemical comfort was socially sanctioned. Compared with George VI's nicotine, it was less visible but potentially more powerful in its grip. Because sedatives don't just calm the body, they can reshape the boundaries of feeling. And as we'll see higher up the list, once opiates enter a royal household, they rarely stay confined to one generation. Which brings us to a prince whose entire life was defined by pain and by the medicines used to silence it. Rank 19, Prince Leopold, Duke of Albany. Prince Leopold, Queen Victoria's youngest son, was born in 1853 into a body that carried a hidden danger, haemophilia. In the 19th century, this condition was poorly understood by the public and brutally limiting in practice. Bleeding could be internal, injuries could be lethal, chronic pain could be constant, and the emotional toll, knowing your own blood might betray you, was its own quiet torment. The setup is therefore not indulgence but survival. A prince who cannot safely roughhouse, cannot safely travel without planning, cannot safely ignore a bruise. Doctors hover, family worries. The court tries to pretend everything is normal because the alternative is fear. But pain doesn't care about etiquette. In that context, opiates were widely used as legitimate medicine. They dulled suffering. They made sleep possible. They offered a kind of mercy in a world with limited alternatives. And that is where the pivot appears. When a substance is both relief and routine, dependence can grow without anyone using the word. A dose becomes a schedule becomes a need becomes the scaffolding holding life together. For Leopold, historians and biographers have often noted that pain management in his era would almost certainly have involved opiate-based preparation, and that long-term use could create a cycle of reliance. The evidence is necessarily indirect. Private medical details were guarded, and the language of addiction was not applied in the same way. But the broader medical context is firm, and the logic is grimly straightforward. A chronically pained patient with ready access to opiates is at high risk of dependence, whether anyone calls it that or not. The consequence is that Leopold's life, though intelligent and socially engaged, remained constrained. He married late, had 2 children, and died young in 1884 after a fall led to catastrophic bleeding. The tragedy is layered. A prince trying to live, a condition that limited him, and a medical culture that offered relief with strings attached. Compared with Queen Victoria's grief medication relationship, Leopold's likely reliance was rooted in physical necessity. Compared with Edward VIII's indulgence, it wasn't escapist, it was the price of enduring. And as we move onward, the story shifts again, from private medicine to public rule, here where dependency doesn't just affect the body, it affects decisions. Rank 18, Queen Anne. Queen Anne's reign, 1702 to 1714, is often summarised as politics, parties, parliaments, wars, and the birth of Great Britain as a political entity. But Anne's private life was marked by relentless physical suffering and repeated personal loss. She endured serious health problems, including painful gout, and the heartbreak of multiple pregnancies that ended in tragedy. In a world without modern pain management, the court turned to what it had: drops, cordials, strong drink, and opiate-based preparations that were common in elite medicine. The setup is desperation disguised as treatment. When the pain flares, something must quiet it. When sleep won't come, something must force it. When anxiety and grief circle like wolves, something must blunt the teeth. Physicians in the early 18th century prescribed mixtures that today raise eyebrows, because many remedies were built on alcohol as a carrier and opium as a sedative. The boundary between medicine and dependency was thin, and for the wealthy, supply was never the problem. The pivot, in Anne's case, is that her health didn't remain a private inconvenience. It became a political factor. Her absences, her limitations, and her visible discomfort shaped how courtiers and ministers moved around her. A monarch who is unwell becomes a monarch who is managed by favourites, by advisors, by whoever can gain access at the right moment. In such conditions, anything that alters mood or clarity matters more than it would for a private citizen. Evidence for the exact degree of Anne's chemical reliance is uneven, because royal medical privacy existed even then, and because the language of the time framed these substances as restoratives, not risk. But the broad outline is well grounded. She suffered. She was treated with the era's strongest available remedies, and those remedies were precisely the kind that could create dependence over time. The consequence is not a tabloid scandal, but a slow narrowing. Anne died in 1714 at 49, physically worn down, leaving a succession problem that reshaped the monarchy and pulled the crown toward the Hanoverian. When you trace that line, pain, treatment, dependence risk, political management, you start to see a theme that repeats across centuries. The monarch's body is never just a body, it's a lever. And speaking of levers, we now step into a court where drinking wasn't just tolerated, it was practically a language of belonging. Rank 17. King James I, James VI of Scotland, became James I of England in 1603, inheriting a court that ran on spectacle, gossip, and the kind of recreation that quietly ruins people. He was brilliant in some ways, bookish, argumentative, endlessly convinced he was right, and physically fragile in others. That combination can push a monarch toward chemical comfort, especially when everyone around him treats success as a loyalty test. Historical accounts from his reign describe drinking as a constant presence at court, and James himself developed a reputation for relying on alcohol. So some later writers even describe episodes of fainting and poor health being worsened by heavy drinking, though it's always worth saying that early modern medical language was imprecise, and enemies loved to exaggerate a king's vices. The detail that makes this entry feel real is how public court drinking could become. A famous example is the 1606 visit of Christian IV of Denmark, James's brother-in-law, remembered for hard drinking, heavy feasting, and revels so messy they became part of the law. That's not just boys being boys. That's a state occasion turning into a month-long bender with bills that annoyed Parliament, and habits that didn't disappear when the guests went home. Compared with Queen Anne's pain-driven remedies, James's pattern reads more like lifestyle dependence. Drink as social glue, drink as stress relief, drink as court culture. And speaking of royal drinking that began as youthful swagger and then had to be painfully reined in, we move to the king, who was literally nicknamed for the sea. Rank 16. King William IV. William IV is often remembered as the Sailor King, which sounds charming until you picture what sailor culture looked like in the late 18th century. Hard language, harder drinking, and a social rhythm built around bravado. William entered the Navy young, spent years in a world where rum was routine, and developed a reputation that followed him long after he stopped climbing rigging. Historical records and biographies describe him as a heavy drinker in his youth, to the point that at least one notorious incident, falling downstairs while drunk, was remembered as an embarrassing marker of how far the habit could go. That's the setup. A prince treated as one of the lads, indulging as proof he belongs, with little incentive to develop restraint because consequences don't land the same way on royal blood. The pivot is what happens when a man like that moves closer to the throne. As the line of succession narrowed, William suddenly needed to look like an adult in charge of a nation, not a boisterous officer at a dockside table. Accounts of his later life emphasize reform, walking for hours, eating more simply, cutting down, allowing his wife Adelaide to nudge him towards something resembling discipline. But reform doesn't erase the earlier pattern. If anything, it proves how intense it must have been to require such a visible course correction. Compared with James I, William's drinking is less a courtly ritual and more a youthful addiction-adjacent lifestyle that had to be forcibly grown out of. And speaking of royal indulgence that didn't grow out of itself, indulgence that may have contributed to an early death and a national power vacuum, we step back into the Wars of the Roses. Rank 15. King Edward IV. Edward IV died on the 9th of April 1483 at just 40, and that single fact, 40, has kept historians arguing for centuries. The official record offered no neat explanation, and that silence invites stories. Some contemporaries and later commentators suspected sudden illness, stroke, infection, even poisoning. Modern researchers still debate the likely cause because medieval bodies don't come with clean charts and lab work, but one accusation appears again and again in the background noise: excess. Contemporary voices criticized Edward as a glutton, overeating, overdrinking, living like a man who believed victory gave him the right to consume without limit. Even if those criticisms were sharpened by politics, they match a broader pattern we see in powerful men who survive war. Once the danger fades, appetite replaces discipline. Feasting becomes proof that the world is safe. Drinking becomes proof that the crown cannot be shaken. The pivot is that excess in medieval terms isn't just personal weakness, it's a court culture. A king's table sets the tone for the nobility's table, and the nobility's table sets the tone for everyone trying to imitate them. If Edward's court rewarded indulgence, it wasn't simply because the king liked it. It was because indulgence became a language of status. And the consequence of Edward's early death was not subtle. It set up a succession crisis around his young sons and helped open the door to the political chaos that followed. Compared with William IV's reform, Edward IV looks like a man whose appetites never met a serious boundary. And if you think medieval excess is too vague to count as addiction, don't worry. The next entry is excess with stage lighting, an entire monarchy rebranded as a party. Rank 14. King Charles II. Charles II returned to England in 1660 after years of exile and war, and the Restoration Court did what traumatized societies often do. It overcorrected. Out went the public gloom. In came the merry monarch, the theatre, the gambling, the late-night laughter, and the endless appetite for sensation. The setup is almost psychological. A king who has lived through instability learns to chase pleasure as a form of control. If he can fill every room with music and bodies, then maybe the silence can't catch him. Alcohol flowed easily in this world, not just as drink, but as social currency. You drank to be included. You drank because the king drank. You drank because sobriety looked like judgment. The pivot is that Charles's pleasures weren't confined to one harmless vice. His court became famous for mistresses and scandal, And while sex addiction is a modern label that doesn't fit neatly onto a 17th century man, the compulsive pattern, always seeking the next diversion, the next thrill, the next proof of vitality, is hard to ignore. When pleasure becomes the primary answer to discomfort, it starts to resemble dependence even without a clinic's vocabulary. Evidence for Charles's drinking and debauched culture isn't scarce. It's woven into contemporary diaries, court commentary, and the sheer volume of stories that survived because people couldn't stop talking about it. The consequence was reputational as much as physical, a monarchy that had to convince the public it was legitimate while also behaving like it was allergic to restraint. Compared with Edward IV's possibly lethal gluttony, Charles II's addiction profile is broader. Pleasure as governance, sensation as identity. And speaking of pleasure that had a price tag, we move to a royal who turned indulgence into an art form, then nearly died from it, right at the moment the world was watching. Rank 13. King Edward VII. Edward VII spent decades as the Prince of Wales, long enough for habits to fossilise into routine. By the time he became king in 1901, he was already famous for living well. Rich food, late nights, cigars, alcohol, and the kind of social life that treats tomorrow like an optional feature. The setup is the slow-building trap of privilege. When you're royal, the environment is designed to say yes. You want another course? It arrives. Another cigar? It's lit. Another drink? It's poured. And because you can always pay the bill, financially and socially, you can pretend nothing is being paid at all. The pivot arrives dramatically in 1902. Edward's coronation had to be postponed after he developed peritonitis, an illness serious enough to force the entire empire to wait while doctors fought to keep him alive. Biographical accounts often frame this as a warning flare. Years of smoking and drinking, years of indulgence, and then the body finally demanding repayment in public. What makes Edward VII a stronger addiction candidate than earlier entries is the sheer consistency of the lifestyle. This wasn't a brief phase, it was a world view. Pleasure as proof of power. He cultivated that identity, and it shaped the culture of the elite around him. Compared with Charles II's chaotic restoration energy, Edward's indulgence is smoother, more modern, almost branded, but it still carries the same logic. If you can't stop, you don't really control it. And speaking of a royal who didn't just enjoy cigarettes but treated them like oxygen, we move to a princess whose habits were so intense that even the palace, famous for looking away, couldn't ignore the consequences. Rank 12. Princess Margaret, a Countess of Snowdon. Princess Margaret is often described as glamour with a sharp edge, beautiful, bored, witty, and quietly furious about the limits placed on her life. But behind the style and the parties was a pattern that reads less like rebellion and more like dependence. Decades of heavy smoking and heavy drinking, repeated so consistently that it eventually wrote itself into her medical history. The setup starts young. She began smoking as a teenager, and in many accounts, never really stopped. Reports over the years described her as a very heavy smoker, sometimes claimed to be dozens of cigarettes a day, and alcohol sat close by, not always as celebration, but as routine. In a royal environment that can make emotional honesty feel like a security risk, nicotine and alcohol become tools. They soften boredom, blunt anxiety, and fill the long, quiet hours that duty doesn't. The pivot is the body keeping score. In 1985, she underwent surgery to remove part of her left lung, an operation that drew painful comparisons to her father's. After that came further health problems, including strokes beginning in 1998, and years marked by illness and fragility until her death in 2002. The evidence here is unusually public for a royal. Newspapers reported her health crises as they happened. Biographers and close associates described the long-term habits, and the timeline of smoking-related illness is brutally consistent. The consequence is that the sparkling image became, in later years, a warning label. Compared with Edward VII's indulgent kingly excess, Margaret's pattern feels more personal and more relentless. substances as coping mechanisms inside a gilded cage. And speaking of a royal whose addiction was widely acknowledged in later life, we move to Queen Victoria's son, a man whose final years were described as clouded by alcohol and ill health. Rank 11. Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh. Prince Alfred, Queen Victoria's second son, lived a life that should have been easy to romanticize. Naval command, international travel, public admiration, a dynastic marriage that linked Britain to continental royalty. And yet many accounts of his later years carry the same grim phrase: alcoholism, illness, and family tragedy. The setup is the quiet misery of being royal without being central. Not the heir, not free, not ordinary. A man with rank and purpose, but also with constraints, expectations, and personal friction that doesn't get solved by promotion. Drinking in that world wasn't unusual, it was normal. At dinners, in clubs, on ships, in drawing rooms where everyone pretended their nerves were fine. The pivot is that Alfred's drinking appears in biographical summaries as more than social habit. More than one modern account describes his last years as clouded by alcoholism, and those years overlapped with deteriorating health and severe family stress, including the suicide of his only son and heir in 1899. Tragedy doesn't create addiction out of thin air, but it can deepen a dependence that already exists, because grief demands anesthesia. The evidence here is not a single dramatic confession. It's the repeated, consistent characterization of his late life by biographers who weren't trying to write a scandal pamphlet, but a sober portrait. That matters. Dennett suggests this wasn't a one-off rumor. It was a pattern people close to the story couldn't avoid. Compared with Princess Margaret's highly visible health consequences, Alfred's addiction reads more like a slow fog settling over a life. Less photographed, less publicly discussed, but still destructive. And speaking of destruction that became so famous it turned into a legend, an execution story soaked in wine, we reach the next name on the countdown. Rank 10. George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence. George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, brother of Edward IV, has one of the most memorable death stories in English history, allegedly drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine after being condemned for treason in 1478. It's the kind of tale that sticks because it's grotesque, specific, and weirdly theatrical. People repeat it because it feels like medieval punishment designed by a dramatist, and that's exactly the point. The setup here is not just a man and a drink. It's propaganda and memory. Clarence was accused of treason against his brother, convicted and executed. The precise method is debated. The Malmsey detail appears as tradition, not as a perfectly attested official note, and it may have been designed to mock him, turning his life into a moral cartoon about excess. But here's the pivot. Even if the wine drowning is legend, the legend itself tells you something real about how people understood vice in elite circle. A story doesn't survive for centuries unless it fits the audience's expectations. The Malmsey tale worked because people already believed a high-born man could be destroyed by appetite, by ambition, by wine, by the hunger for more. So Clarence makes this list as a symbol of how addiction stories are used as weapons. Sometimes the Addicts label isn't medical, it's political. It's a way to shrink a complicated person into a single vice, so everyone can feel satisfied when the axe falls. Compared with Alfred's late-life alcoholism, Clarence's addiction is murkier, more mythic, and yet it shows how deeply the idea of compulsive indulgence was embedded in royal storytelling. And speaking of indulgence, we can actually trace in the bones, literally. We move to a king whose remains offered modern science an uncomfortable clue. Rank 9. Queen Elizabeth I. If you're expecting a syringe or a scandal at rank 9, you get something older and sneakier: sugar. Elizabeth I ruled in an age when sugar was not a supermarket staple. It was an expensive status symbol, displayed as much as eaten. Contemporary observers remarked on her fondness for sweets, and later descriptions of her teeth and oral health became part of the legend. the smile that ruled an empire quietly decaying behind the paint and ceremony. The setup is simple. In a court where everything was theatre, sweetmeats weren't just dessert. They were power, luxury, and comfort you could swallow. And because nobody was going to tell the Queen enough, cravings could become routine. The pivot, as with all compulsions that look harmless, is that the bill arrives slowly. Pain, infection, and the kind of chronic discomfort that doesn't make a neat headline but can shape mood, sleep, and stamina. Is it addiction in the modern clinical sense? That's disputed, and we should be honest about that, but it's absolutely a royal pattern, a habit amplified by privilege until it leaves physical evidence behind. And speaking of physical evidence, this time literally in the bones, we move to a king whose remains forced historians to imagine a very well-stocked table. Rank 8, King Richard III. Richard III reigned for just over 2 years, and most conversations about him get hijacked by politics, princes, propaganda, and Shakespeare's shadow. But modern scientific analysis of his remains added a quieter detail that startled people for a different reason. The results have been interpreted as suggesting that, especially after becoming king, Richard's diet was dramatically high status. Lots of rich animal protein, plentiful fish, and plenty of wine compared with ordinary people of his era. And the setup here isn't he couldn't stop drinking in a way we can clinically diagnose. It's more revealing than that. It's the speed with which royal living turns indulgence into baseline. When someone's status rises, their table changes and the court expects them to eat like their rank. The pivot is that luxury becomes normal so quickly that restraint feels like deprivation. The comparative element matters. Plenty of medieval nobles ate heavily. But Richard's case is remarkable because we can detect a shift, an escalation that tracks with the crown itself. The crown doesn't only change what you can command. It changes what you consume, day after day, until it becomes the life you defend. Outcome. This isn't the worst addiction on the list, but it is a reminder that royal habits don't always arrive as scandal. Sometimes they arrive as evidence. Meanwhile, there's a royal whose vices weren't inferred from bones. They were whispered about while he was alive, and argued over ever since. Rank 7, Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale. Prince Albert Victor, known in family circles as Eddie, was the eldest son of the future Edward VII and for a time, second in line to the throne. He died young in 1892 during an influenza pandemic, and his early death created a vacuum where rumour rushed in to fill the silence. The setup is that Eddie lived at the intersection of privilege and scrutiny. He moved through a late Victorian elite world of clubs, parties, and guarded secrets, exactly the kind of environment where people could indulge and still keep their public image intact. The pivot is that, after his death, whose stories hardened into legend, claims of excessive nightlife, claims of brothels, even occasional insinuations about drugs. Some accounts go further than the evidence can safely support, and historians have long treated many of the more lurid stories as disputed, exaggerated, or shaped by the era's appetite for scandal. So why include him at all? Because this is part of the machinery of royal addiction stories. Sometimes the evidence is strong and medical, sometimes it's political and social, an anxious public trying to explain why a royal life seems to burn out fast. Eddie's story demonstrates how quickly habit and vice become narrative tools once the subject can't defend himself. And speaking of a royal who very much did live long enough to earn his reputation, we move to a man whose problem wasn't rumour, it was routine. To rank 6, Prince George, Duke of Cambridge. Prince George, Duke of Cambridge, grandson of George III and a central military figure in the 19th century, spent decades at the top of British society while resisting many reforms. His public image leaned on sturdiness and tradition. Privately, his era's elite culture was soaked in alcohol, and contemporary commentary about him often circles around hard living. Heavy drinking, heavy socializing, and the kind of boys' club environment where excess is framed as strength. The setup is the familiar one: power without accountability. When your rank cushions you from consequences, habits can grow louder. The pivot comes when those habits start to shape judgment and reputation. Even without a single confession document, the weight of repeated character descriptions suggests a man for whom drinking was not merely occasional. Drinking was embedded. The comparative element here is the way military and royal masculinity fuse. You weren't just drinking, you were performing toughness. The drink becomes part of your identity, and the identity becomes harder to change than the habit. Outcome: the Duke of Cambridge remained influential for years, but he also became a symbol of stubbornness and institutional stagnation. Someone the modernizing forces of his time had to push around rather than persuade. And speaking of an addiction story we don't have to infer at all, because the person told it themselves, we step into the 21st century. Rank 5. Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex. When addiction enters a royal narrative in the modern era, the evidence changes. It isn't only diaries and whispers, sometimes it's self-report. In Prince Harry's own public account of his life, he described periods of heavy drinking and acknowledged using drugs, including cannabis and experimentation with other substances when he was younger. Whatever you think of his choices, it's unusual royal transparency, especially in a family trained to say nothing and smile. The setup is grief and pressure. He grew up inside the global spotlight and lost his mother young, an event that reshaped not only his emotions but how the world looked at him. In his telling, substances became a way to numb, to quiet the noise, to push away feelings he didn't know how to hold. The pivot is that the royal system can make these coping strategies easier to hide for longer, until they become part of a public identity anyway. When you're surrounded by protection, you can postpone consequences. When your name is a headline, the consequences eventually find you in full daylight. The comparative element is striking. Where earlier royals relied on doctors, courtiers, or myths to frame their habits, Harry framed his as part of a mental health journey, a confession that tries to turn private struggle into public meaning. Outcome: not a collapsed reign, but a public rupture, a life split between institution and independence, and a modern reminder that royal privilege doesn't prevent dependency, it just changes the shape of the story. And speaking of dependency that did end in collapse, not political collapse, but personal ruin, we return to the 18th century's most romantic failure. Rank 4. Charles Edward Stuart. Bonnie Prince Charlie. Charles Edward Stuart is remembered as a romantic figure. Tartan, rebellion, the doomed 1745 rising. But the later chapters of his life are far less cinematic. After defeat and exile, accounts of him increasingly describe a downward spiral marked by heavy drinking, an alcoholism shaped by loss, bitterness, and the slow realization that history wasn't going to give him a second chance. The setup is trauma, with nowhere to go. A young man raised to believe he was a rightful king, briefly treated like a savior, then crushed and hunted. Once the dream dies, what do you do with the person you became while chasing it? In exile, drink offers the fastest answer: forgetfulness, then routine, then need. The pivot is how public the decline became in elite European circles. This wasn't a private gentleman's habit, as it was a visible deterioration described by observers who watched him lose charm, self-control, and dignity. The comparative element is brutal. Earlier in life, he could command loyalty with charisma. Later, the bottle commanded him. Outcome: a claimant reduced to a cautionary tale. The Jacobite cause didn't die solely because he drank, but his decline helped bury it, because movements need symbols and addiction can shatter symbolism from the inside. If you think that was bleak, remember, alcohol is only one chapter in royal dependency. Next comes a king whose appetites sprawled across food, pleasure, and pain relief, until even his own body became a political problem. Rank 3. Henry VIII. Henry VIII's image has been flattened into caricature. The enormous king, the wives, the rage. But behind the portrait is a pattern that looks less like simple, bad behavior and more like compulsion enabled by absolute power. Henry ate and drank like a man for whom limits were insults. He gambled heavily. He chased risk, sport, and sensation as if still trying to prove he was immortal. The setup begins with youth, athletic, competitive, surrounded by courtiers who mirrored his desires back to him as praise. Then comes the pivot, pain. After injuries and as he aged, Henry suffered chronic health problems, including leg ulcers and debilitating discomfort. In early modern medicine, pain was treated with powerful substances, strong alcohol, sedating preparations, and remedies that could include opiate-based ingredients common in the period. We can't diagnose him from the future, and we should be careful. The records don't hand us a clean addiction chart, but the pattern is coherent. Escalating consumption, escalating pain, escalating need for relief. The comparative element is that Henry's compulsions didn't stay personal. They spilled into governance, moods, punishments, paranoia, and the violent enforcement of his will. When a monarch's coping mechanisms fail, the entire country feels it. Outcome? A reign that reshaped religion, law, and culture, powered in part by appetites that no one could safely challenge. And speaking of substances that were not merely consumed but depended upon, we move to a royal whose private chemistry was whispered about even among people paid to keep quiet. Rank 2. Prince George, Duke of Kent. Prince George, a Duke of Kent, brother of George VI and uncle to Queen Elizabeth II, lived a life that looked dazzling from the outside and dangerous up close. Many biographers and long-standing accounts describe him as struggling with serious substance issues, including dependence on drugs such as morphine, along with heavy drinking during an era when elite access and elite privacy could hide a lot, until it couldn't. The setup is interwar high society, parties, travel, fast money, fast friendships, and a royal identity that offered both thrill and emptiness. In that environment, drugs weren't framed as a street danger. They were framed as a fashionable risk, a sophisticated escape, a private solution. The pivot is that dependence doesn't care about class. Morphine doesn't ask whether you have a title, and it only asks whether you want the relief again, and then it starts deciding for you. The comparative element here is severity. Unlike smoking or social drinking, opiate dependence can reorganize an entire life around supply, secrecy, and mood swings. It changes relationships, it changes judgment, it invites blackmail, accidents, and medical crises. Even the most carefully managed household can't fully control what a strong dependency demands. Outcome? Prince George's life ended abruptly in 1942 in a wartime plane crash. An event layered with speculation because his private life had already trained people to suspect hidden explanations. Whether or not every rumor is true, the core pattern is strong enough to earn this ranking. A royal life running on substances powerful enough to destroy ordinary lives in silence. At least that story had an end. The next one is a slow catastrophe. Years of cravings, debts, and chemicals, all wrapped inside the most expensive costume in Britain. Rank 1, King George IV. George IV is the full, terrible anthology of royal addiction. Alcohol, gambling, compulsive spending, and the kind of medical self-soothing that blurred into dependence. Long before he became king, he was already living like a monarch without the job description, surrounding himself with luxury, borrowing recklessly, and using sensation as his main form of emotional regulation. The setup is the perfect storm: a glamorous young Prince of Wales, a rigid father, George III, endless money on paper, and a political system that could scold him but couldn't truly restrain him. Gambling became a vortex. Debt became normal. Indulgence became identity. And when the body started breaking under the weight of excess, pain, inflammation, illness, doctors of the period relied on strong remedies that could include opiate-based preparations and heavy sedation. Again, we can't diagnose with modern certainty, but we can observe the pattern. Escalating discomfort met with escalating chemical relief, all inside a lifestyle already built around compulsion. The pivot is that his addictions became national expenses. Parliament repeatedly had to deal with his finances. Public opinion turned sour, and the monarchy's moral authority took damage. Even his private relationships, especially his marriage, became battlegrounds shaped by appetite, resentment, and the refusal to accept limits. The comparative element is simple. Many royals had a vice. George IV had an ecosystem of vices feeding each other. Say gambling feeds stress, stress feeds drinking, drinking feeds poor health feeds sedation, sedation feeds isolation, isolation feeds more indulgence. The loop tightens until the crown is wearing the man, not the other way around. Outcome: a reign remembered less for statesmanship than for excess, an object lesson in what happens when privilege removes the last meaningful no. So what do we do with a list like this? 25 people wrapped in velvet, surrounded by servants, carrying habits that would be recognized in any ordinary street as dependence, compulsion, or slow self-destruction. The first truth is uncomfortable. Monarchy doesn't protect against addiction. In some ways, it invites it. The royal system is designed to remove friction. Food arrives, drink arrives, cigarettes arrive. Yeah, doctors arrive with bottles and powders meant to keep the machine running. And because the royal body is also a national symbol, everyone around that body is trained to manage appearances first and consequences later. The second truth is darker. Addiction in royalty has ripple effect. George VI's smoking didn't just harm a man, it shortened a reign and accelerated a generational shift. Princess Margaret's cigarettes and drink didn't just damage her health, they became a visible warning about what glamour can cost. Bonnie Prince Charlie's alcoholism didn't just ruin a life, it helped bury a political dream. Henry VIII's appetites weren't merely personal, they reshaped policy, punishment, and fear. And George IV, at the top of the pile, didn't just indulge, he forced the nation to subsidize indulgence, to explain it, to normalize it, and to pay the social bill when the monarchy's image cracked. And then there's the quietest pattern of all, the stories that hover in the uncertain space. Henry I and the Lampreys, Clarence and the Malmsey, Albert Victor and the rumours. Even when the evidence isn't absolute, the existence of the story tells you what people suspected and what they needed to believe about power. A king dies young, so he must have overindulged. A prince disappoints, so he must have been weak. Addiction becomes a moral shorthand, sometimes fair, sometimes weaponized, always revealing. If there's a final lesson, it's this: the crown magnifies everything. It magnifies pleasure, it magnifies pain, it magnifies the urge to escape. And when escape becomes habit, habit becomes dependency, and dependency becomes history. If you want another long, calm journey through Britain's most uncomfortable truths, royal scandals, dark laws, hidden deaths, the parts of the past that don't fit on a souvenir mug, subscribe, and let's keep going. Because the next time someone says the royals were above ordinary weakness, you'll know the answer.